Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Layer 123 World Congress. And we have a panel session titled Powering 5G, Enabling a Dynamic Network from the Radio to the Edge to the Core. And joining me, we have a wonderful panel. I'm going to start with Angela. Angela, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Roy, and it's great to be here on this panel. My name is Angela Logothetis. I'm the CTO for Amdocs in the Network, and I'm on the board of the 5G Open Innovation Lab.
Excellent. Thank you, Angela. And then next we have Dewan. Dewan, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Dewan Young from Verizon Partner Solutions. I support all of our platforms and applications within our global wholesale group.
Excellent. Thanks, Dewan. And Gint, introduce yourself, please. Unmute, please.
Hi, I'm Gint Atkinson, and I head up network strategy and digital architecture for SCS, where we deliver content and connectivity everywhere on the globe, straight from space.
Excellent. And up next, we have Jeff.
Jeff Tansura, senior principal network architect with Microsoft.
Excellent, Jeff, and very nice T-shirt. Then finally, we have Bob. Bob, introduce yourself, please, Jeff.
Thanks, Roy. Bob Titus, I'm the CTO of Netcracker. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, excellent. Thank you, panel. And we will be discussing the need for and the role of a dynamic network as we roll out 5G and new carrier initiatives. What are the market needs and use cases does a dynamic network address, right? What kind of monetization will be needed and what's possible? And what type of ecosystem will support these dynamic networks? We'll be breaking up today's panel in 4 sections of about 10 to 15 minutes each. We're going to talk about market needs and use cases, then the financial benefits, followed by carrier readiness. And then finally, we'll talk about partnerships and ecosystem. So let's get started. First, let's start with use cases and real-world examples. So let's do a quick run-through of the new real-world use cases that 5G has enabled or is enabling, and either in production or real-world trials. So not hypotheticals, but real. We can actually touch it. Can you explain why these use cases depend on or can benefit from a dynamic network? We'll start with Dewan.
Sure. So with our partners, we're having a conversation on a daily basis about digital transformation. So the digitization of their businesses, from their customer experiences to their business processes, complete digitization of all that they're doing from a business perspective. And from a real world perspective, that was accelerated from the pandemic. So a lot of the digital transformation that we're seeing across enterprises and businesses rely on the connectivity, the application, and all of the dynamic networking that we're talking about in today's panel. So everywhere from the federal space to manufacturing and factories, how they do their businesses, how their equipment works, retail spaces, the experiences that they have. Healthcare has been transformative in the way that, again, with the pandemic, how do we do medicine and how we relate to our patients. Venues and experiences. Verizon is a partner of the NFL and NBA and other venues and stadiums, and we're transforming the experiences that those who visit those venues have while they're in those stadiums and coliseums today. So you mentioned real world and real time. We're doing all of that today, and as we talk about AR and VR and what our friends at Facebook are taking us to the metaverse, as all of that occurs and we go driven down that pipeline, all of those things are use cases and will be enabled by 5G.
Excellent. Thank you. Panel, anything else to add to those cool use cases? Obviously, sports and entertainment, always a huge thing, but also healthcare, telehealth, and some of these new use cases, maybe not remote surgery quite yet, but maybe someday. And then certainly something as mundane and simple as just connecting people wherever they are in a flexible and resilient way, right? Anyone want to add to that? Oh, excellent.
Well, if we look at
it, yeah.
If we think about those use cases, one thing to bear in mind is relative to what's dynamic, everything is moving. We all know that the end user's on the move with their terminal and their handset. But what used to be a terminal or a handset is turning into a platform. And now the platform is starting to move around, the network is starting to reshape, and everything is increasingly mobile now. So that's one thing. It allows service to be consumed anywhere. It allows you to restructure your resources, move the use cases around. Everything's on the move. Let's keep that in mind. So the resources have to be stitched together dynamically.
Good point, Gin. And I think, yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think if the users are dynamic, if the devices, in fact, are moving around dynamically and the business needs are changing relatively rapidly or to adapt, then the network as a platform has to do the same. And so seeing that, what are the key attributes of this dynamic network? And perhaps if you could provide some examples of dynamism from the RAN to the edge to the core, and maybe beyond if you want to. So we'll actually kick this question off with Angela. Angela.
Yeah, great, Roy. And I was interested in the comments earlier. I 100% agree that the end users, the enterprises and the consumers are driving the need for these dynamic networks. But if we look at the enablers or the building blocks of the dynamic network that need to be there to start to deliver those digital transformations, I think there are 4 key things. The first is the compute power, right? Whether it be public or private, that compute power has to be there. The second thing is the connectivity and the network functions, which really need to be software defined, virtualized, or preferably cloud native. And then there are 2 other layers on top of that. One is what we call the network software layer. And this is the layer, this is like the magic ingredient, if you like, that enables the automation, the AI intelligence, and the monetization of the network. And then the final one is kind of this digital experience software layer that connects the customers and the partners onto the network. So when we think about a dynamic network, I think we need to think about more than just connectivity. We have to think connectivity, compute, and cloud, and then these software layers that really stitch it all or fuse it all together and make it happen for the customer. So that's kind of what we think about. And when we start to see dynamic networks coming to life today, I know earlier, Roy, you said, hey, tell me what's real versus what's, off into the future. We see a number of things. Shared spectrum, okay, dynamic spectrum allocation, that's happening with things like CPRS in the US and inside Germany and inside UK at the moment. MIMO and beamforming in the RAN, which is starting to dynamically allocate the fairly scarce capacity in the RAN to dedicated devices or dedicated users. Policy control at the edge and at the core. Policy control has been around for a long time, but it's a key part of the networks and a key part of 5G, and it's moving out towards the edge. And then this probably then steps a little bit more into the future, but this concept of end-to-end slicing, dynamic allocation of resources and capacity to deliver a certain quality of experience or a certain service out to a customer. And that's kind of what we're on the cusp of and where we're heading to next.
Excellent. Thank you, Angela. Pretty comprehensive, starting with the stack required to deliver a dynamic network. And agreed, we shouldn't forget it's not just the transport and the underlying connectivity layer, but it's everything else above that that makes it a modern network, right? Including the UX layer. That makes a lot of sense. And UX/API layer to that as well. So absolutely. And let's see, Bob, anything to add to Angela's answer on that one? Key attributes of a dynamic network.
Well, I think Angela mentioned all the core pillars of dynamic networks and what's required. I think where we've been focusing is on looking at specific use cases, right? So how do we do the MIMO beam optimization, leveraging the RAN intelligent controller, right? So how do we dynamically gather inputs from thousands of base stations, all the performance parameters, look at that, and then optimize the network using artificial intelligence and machine learning. So those are the types of use cases that we're focused on to make sure that that network can react dynamically to how it's being used, to the performance characteristics. And that's just one example. You can do that at the edge. You can do that at the core. You can do that with over-the-top services like SD-WAN, and then optimize how you're deploying those resources out to the edge. And then equally as important is giving those controls to the end customer. So if the end customer wants to change their quality of service, if they want to increase their bandwidth, if they want to move network functions around, you give the ability for the actual end consumers or the businesses to control their network and do that in a very open, automated, and customer-friendly way.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think fundamentally, as we build up, it used to be a pretty static network, right? You connect this point A to point B, you're done. And now I think what we're seeing and what you guys are saying is that the network is not just a straight, a wire with sort of two ends. It's now a platform. It's a dynamic living type platform that you can program, you can do something with, and you can make it sort of bend to your will as necessary to support your business or consumer needs. And I think that's pretty interesting, right? The exposure of the network to the user, but in the way that the user or the applications can actually consume it without having to go in depth into programming every single element, right? And the key is, how do you abstract that? How do you tie that so that businesses can actually take advantage of it? So excellent, very good. So let me maybe ask Jeff and then after that Gint. So Jeff, can you relate this desire, right? This requirement for dynamism, this desire to have this dynamic sort of programmable living network, right? Are there larger trends in business and technologies that also impact this requirement for dynamism?
Absolutely. So Angela built really good foundation for what's needed to build 5G and potentially 6G on top of it. There's another side of it, which is really on demand, right? Traditionally, we have been buying capacity, hardware, software on top for the peaks, which is inefficient in terms of CapEx, which is even more inefficient in terms of OpEx. Finally, we can deliver the services, the hardware needed, the bandwidth needed, the spectrum needed on demand, truly on demand, when needed and at peak. So it completely changes the economics of delivering service, right? And this is how people are looking into the future rather than trying to build everything themselves. We see larger ecosystem to provide end-to-end services that are easily consumable from a customer perspective, that are easily deployable from backend perspective. If we are looking from technology trends, traditionally 3G was kind of an overlay on top of IP network, to some degree overlay on top of backhaul. Now, given the requirements with regard to latency, pretty much lossless networking. Finally, we need to provide end-to-end story with regards to quality of experience, quality of service, and you need to measure it, as Bob said. You need to build different pillars and charge them accordingly, as Angela said. So without ecosystem, we cannot build anymore. There's no single company that's capable of building end-to-end by themselves.
So, very key, and I think that is, I think, well appreciated, that the need for that dynamism, that the need, but that also the need for end-to-end, right? And so I think, now that we have a picture in our mind that Angela built, which is this stack picture, and then this end-to-end picture that is Bob building out across all elements of the network. So again, what else are you seeing that this dynamism in networking related to in business? Are there trends that impact it or concurrent with it or maybe drive it?
Yeah, I think a big thing that is really happening with the 5G based revolution, you see a massive amount of new technology that is being driven by use cases and driven by use cases, industries, and vertical applications. We've got our smart cities, we've got our smart ports, whether it's an airport, a marine port, but the smart ports and the smart city really highlight some amazing business use cases that require the dynamic re-architecting of resources and stitching those resources together. Let's say you have a platoon, a whole fleet of trucks, and you're going to need all sorts of IoT, and you're going to want to ramp up the level of IoT and the level of telemetry you're bringing back to the cloud, how much edge you're putting out onto those vehicles. And you start looking at your map of where your trucks are, where they're going to be, at what point in time, and you discover these trucks are going to be on the highway when there's a whole bunch of demand for content, connectivity, and other mobility services. So now all of a sudden you can fill in gaps of content and connectivity and other services, and you have a moving platform. So I think this is one thing. You start accreting more and more resources and more capabilities into your endpoints. And then as the network is more dynamic and the services are more intelligent and they can migrate to execute and deliver value in different points, you know, all of a sudden a logistics company that's operating trucks on highways can add all sorts of value for content and connectivity and become part of the infrastructure. There's a lot of things tying together services, resources dynamically to fulfill highly mobile and highly agile use cases.
Yep, no, that makes a lot of sense, right? I think what we're seeing is that businesses it's a resource allocation problem for businesses that are going global, and they're trying to make use of basically resources in a more dynamic, agile fashion, physical resources, natural resources everywhere. And I think back to what the one started with, which is digital transformation, which I know we all overuse, but it is legit, right? It is, because fundamentally, as you transform into the digital and you're trying to use computing services, then the key is to get those computing services and the data to those services anytime, anywhere that you see fit, where it makes the most sense from a business goal standpoint, from a cost standpoint, and what transports, you know, that computing elements, what transports the data is the network. And so the network has no choice but to follow that agility that we're looking for from a resource allocation, resource management, resource optimization standpoint. So that's I think that makes a lot of sense. And thank you. So let's move on to section 2, financial benefits. So I think that's all great. We want to build these wonderful networks that are agile, that are dynamic, good, but are they chargeable? And so we're going to talk about that in this section, right? So because at the same time, these things cost money. It's not free to build these things, right? So agile, flexible, dynamic networks, do they actually, but let's start with, you know, do these networks actually lead to reduce OpEx or CapEx? Or are we just trying to do more with less, right? Or maybe it's just a matter of where we're moving our spend, because one of those things is dynamic networks are great for our customers as carriers and suppliers to carriers. Dynamic networks are great for them, but for us, I've heard that these things are supposed to be easier, cheaper to build and maintain. I don't know if that's true. Dewan, what do you think?
So first of all, I think we could have a party game around the overuse of digital transformation.
But I think we'll probably gonna like check, you know, like I think it appears 20 times. So go ahead.
It sounds but the truth is it is an important piece there. I think there's a dichotomy though, and we're touching on it. It's the digital transformation that's happening with enterprises and consumers, and then with the network providers like the Verizons and the mobile network operators, where SDN, NFV have been a part of our transformation for the last 2 years in preparation for where things were going with our enterprise customers and our consumers. So those two components of how do we get away from the legacy hardware and software associated with our network, gain efficiencies. Of course, there's CapEx and OpEx efficiencies in the rebuild out and the transformation of our overall network. But then to the enterprise, on the other side of that dichotomy of what are the efficiencies that our customers, our enterprises, and our consumers see in that. So we enhance their experiences, but I think at the heart and the core of digital transformation is the ability to bring forward more efficiency. So we saw this in the cloud space, where we moved from the traditional models to more cloud native models for applications, critical mission applications, and the efficiencies that were gained with cloud. I think it's the same thing with 5G and everything that we'll see from dynamic networking, network slicing, and the ability to truly take advantage of seasonality, of ultra low latency applications, and also high precision processing needs. All of those efficiencies will be gained, and you'll see that from a CapEx and an OpEx basis.
Got it. Makes sense, the one. And I think thank you for tying it to the cloud analogy, which makes a lot of sense, right? If the carriers can get to that agility and scale that the cloud providers have for computing, there should, I wouldn't say there's no reason, but there are probably many reasons, but we should be able to achieve sort of similar efficiencies and similar scale, right? So again, what do you think? Agree or disagree with the one? I know you always agree, but you know,
Yeah. You always, I'm like, what I always do.
yeah, every time on
agree.
panels, you're like, yes, the one's right, right? And the one's like, yeah, again's right, right? But maybe additional points of view, right?
Yeah, I like to look at the point that you highlighted. At are we making it cheaper, for example? We are, but the problem is order of magnitudes more complex. And we've done an amazing job as an industry and have very huge gains to move into the cloud beyond the forklift upgrade. But again, I want to highlight on the business side, the opportunity is to not only radically reduce costs, but we want to do much more complicated things and intertwine them so that more people can monetize. And I want to go back to the mobile example. Why just be as a vehicle? Why just be a consumer of telemetry when that vehicle is also needed to publish the telemetry and the real-time observations? So we see this emerging in the standards. It's getting sorted out, vehicle safety, smart vehicles, smart highways, and all of this. But the point that I'm driving at is now we're building standards and infrastructure that are capable of consuming and producing. So as a fleet owner or a vehicle owner, why just consume content when you can become an Instagram sensation or a YouTube sensation? So turn it into
media for trucks. I see that, Gint. Social media for trucks. That's great. No, I'm kidding. Why not? Why not? Right? Why not?
So I think there's a lot you have to invest in resources. You have to invest in platforms. Don't just use the platforms to generate the legacy services. Intertwine the platforms and interweave them into a new fabric to offer and generate more and to produce more.
Excellent. No, that's a very good point, and it's very meta of you, Gint, on that point. It's not just users, but it's also devices and everything in the metaverse. Very good. So actually, what you just said leads us to the next question, which is not monetization, right? And as you point out, it's not the same way maybe we monetize, but there are other ways to create value and extract value, right? So speaking of, what models of monetization are you seeing from your customers, the service providers? I'm going to ask this of Bob and Angela first, and then Jeff after that. Are there creative ways, as again just pointed out, are there creative ways of capturing value from the market? And what role would this new dynamic network play? Start with Bob, and then Angela, and then Jeff, if you have any thoughts as well, that'd be welcome. So Bob.
Yeah, so we see sort of four key things around monetization. One is really the ability to charge based on any parameter. So whether that's a location-based service, whether that's a dynamic quality of service, whether that's usage, whether that's an application, type of application, all of those parameters from a real-time convergent charging perspective, whether it's a slice or a fixed private 5G network, you need to be able to have flexibility in how you charge for services. The second key area is being able to have a marketplace of partners that you offer their services across that infrastructure. Whether that's your own infrastructure, whether that's a cloud infrastructure, or most likely a combination of multiple infrastructures. So you have to have the right ecosystem of services and be able to offer subscriptions to those services to monetize that infrastructure. That, of course, leads to the ability to manage effectively your partner ecosystem. So if you can't onboard partners effectively, if you can't work with them and offer their services, you won't be very successful in monetizing. So that partnership management, ecosystem management becomes critical. And then finally, I think there's opportunities around as you deploy all of these services. How are you securing them? How are you leveraging all the data that's being gathered? How are you monetizing those aspects? So I think there's lots of different avenues for creating value in this environment, and it requires a lot of different capabilities to make sure you can take advantage of all the different ways of monetization.
Yep, no, that definitely makes sense, and sort of your four elements in terms of bringing an ecosystem together, providing a marketplace that you can showcase those ecosystems, managing those partners in your ecosystem, and obviously ways to secure, monetize, operate that whole platform. Right, makes a lot of sense. So Angela, anything to add to what Bob just said, or maybe new viewpoints?
Yeah, we see two parts to monetization, or at least the conversations that we're having with network executives across the globe are in two parts. The first question going through their minds is, what is the new value, or how do I create new value on the network? That's kind of the number one network question that's out there. And this more gets into things like, what else can I put into the network? Am I going to expose network as a service or network as a platform, or am I going to start to expose APIs to the network, or slices on the network, or data out of the network? They're all about what are the things that'll give more value out to an enterprise, a partner, or a consumer on top of the network. So that's the first thing they're trying to do. Then the second thing after that is, okay, so now I've got this thing that we think of as some value to somebody. How am I going to monetize it? What are the sort of different sort of monetization models, whether they're new ways, new as a service type models, whether they're two-way models where some of the monetization comes from the partner and some of the monetization comes from the end user. All of these sorts of things are kind of up for discussion. And we're also seeing some things back to the question about financial models and, are these new dynamic networks reducing CapEx or OpEx? One of the things that we're seeing is people trying to get a handle around the question, okay, so if I'm a farmer and I just want to use a drone once during crop growing season, once a week during 3 months of the year during crop growing season, then how am I prepared to pay for that? Because if I have to pay for the drone and the SIM card and the drone and the data and the AI, it kind of makes it non-economically viable for me as a crop farmer to do that. But actually, if I could have a monetization model that just lets me fly that drone for 1 week of the year and pay for that, then that makes financial sense. So we're also starting to see more of these business sort of model discussions happening, and looking at one who would invest the capex in that end-to-end use case, as well as who would then monetize that end-to-end use case.
Excellent points. And yes, I think to add to what Bob just said, which is value. The creation of value, the extraction of value, and then the extraction of value, as you point out, is not a straightforward, you pay right now type thing, right? It's pay as you go. Yep. Who does the capex? Who does the investment? And who does the ongoing subscription? Who takes on the financial burden and the risk? And how do you convert that into a steady stream of income for the people who need to consume it and don't have the capital capabilities or the financial capabilities to pay for it up front? I think that's all definitely elements that we want to think through, and having a more dynamic network, sort of modular or flexible, gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can try out and experiment with or take to market. I think that is very valuable to me. I think one of the things I heard, this was probably 2 years ago, where it was a big game manufacturer, and the network trials that were being run at that point in time was the gamer. It wasn't the end user that was paying for better quality of service. It was the game manufacturer. But then what you would do is you would go on a premium tier as you were in the critical part of the game and say, I'm going to go premium now because I want better reaction times. And then you get charged for that by the game manufacturer. But in fact, the game manufacturer pays the carrier to turn it on for you, right? And so for you, it feels transparent. You don't even know you're getting better quality of service, so to speak, from the network. You just know that your game's better and you kill faster. Not that. Well, you can accumulate points faster. Sorry, that's more PG-13 type examples. But yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jeff.
More of a
Sorry, go ahead.
On Gint's point, we're seeing more of those sort of models around things like private enterprise networks. So in ports or transportation, where you may have many different companies or many different subscribers coming in and out of that location. And so how do you monetize all of that infrastructure and connectivity and maybe even edge and cloud that's been built there, but across many different parties?
Right. Yeah, it becomes a complex little marketplace that you have to figure out how to manage and monetize, right? It's back to what Bob said. Yes, the one. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to Angela's point. As a carrier, I think she's spot on. The monetization specifically, our focus is network as a service, in 21 and 22. Monetizing above the network, finding new ways to monetize. I think it starts with digital transformation with the enterprises, but then it's how can they actually use it, to the farm example, to the manufacturing example, and really get down to their business needs and then really figure out how to implement. So it's a technical component to it, but you're really solving business questions with the new paradigm with dynamic networking.
Yep, no, very fair. And now let's see, Jeff, any couple of words you want to add? Oh, sorry, Jeff, you're on mute.
I would think we are going through similar learning curve as we did with basic computing, starting with infrastructure as a service, growing into platform, growing into really software as a service, right? If you look at what you could choose today from a contributor to 5G ecosystem, could be anything from bare metal at the edge up to fully running 5G core. In Microsoft case would be Affirmed and Metaswitch acquisition, right? Mm-hmm. So given all this variety of services you can choose from, you can also focus on something that you're competent and outsource something you would prefer to consume as a service. And obviously layer of APIs on top is fundamental to that. On another side, we are moving into smaller and smaller bits of consumption. So we went from vendor box on location to VM on telco cloud to containers or cloud functions on public cloud. Same goes to networking. Even so, we don't see it as much. We are going from basic VPN you could get into more and more sliced and virtualized networking with very different capabilities. And this allows us to monetize them accordingly. If someone really needs lossless network, I don't know, remote procedures that really require no single packet loss, you cannot deliver, and not everybody needs it. So you need to be able to slice your network accordingly. So whoever wants to pay for lossless network should be able to get it, but whoever doesn't really should be able to get different slices at a much lower price, perhaps less capacity or more capacity, but less quality of service. So being able to build different pieces from very basic building block infrastructurally to the service layer that provides different capabilities, and again, on demand, dynamically, and at cost that is attractive to both provider and consumer, I think fundamental to really progress here.
Yep. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? How do you get it so the network, can charge the right people for the right services and give those to them, to the ones that need it, right? And so speaking of, how do we get there? We'll go to section number 3 of sort of 4 parts of our panel. We'll talk about carrier readiness, right? So let me turn this question to Gint. So where are the carriers today in terms of, building, and running dynamic networks? And is the level of maturity different across the different parts of the network, the back office, the core, transport, RAN, and so on? What are your thoughts, Gint?
So I come from, if we look at the RAN and getting to the core, I come from a distinctively problematic part of the networking industry. Satcom is all custom built. Yep. And you see that a lot of satellite operators, service providers, are also manufacturing their satellites instead of going to the big traditional companies, and there's some reasons for that. So SES was lucky. We were able to go with the help of Microsoft and Amdocs. In under 2 years, we took all of our BSS and all of our OSS and put it in cloud native Azure. I have lots of complaints, with our team. We're not doing this, we're not doing that. But the reality is we were really able to move all of that straight into the cloud. Giant benefits there. We have network slice orchestration up and running thanks to Amdocs. The only problem is I can't orchestrate a slice of my RF chain because we have to write the control plane for all of those antennas, for all of the radio resource infrastructure. We have to buy the bucks, buy the antennas, the RF matrix. We can't buy a turnkey solution. So we've managed to take our management plane stack and much of our control plane and totally integrate it. But we have all of these special radios that sit inside satellites. And again, ask those big satellite manufacturers if they want to support O-RAN. And the answer is in 50 years. They're supporting O-RAN when they're operating on Mars with us. So yeah, we have a big challenge. They do appear really similar. The pattern is very similar on terrestrial RAN. But we've got non-terrestrial networks as part of 3GPP17. We drove that out. We're with Microsoft, with Gilat, and with Kratos. We've virtualized the modem hub gateways, so they're running inside Azure on top of the GPUs and/or FPGA farms. But we don't have that 3GPP control plane. We don't have the near real-time RICs that we really want to have, and we desperately need them. So we've done well, and I think we don't have the types of OSS problems that a large operator like Verizon would have. So we were able to quickly move into the cloud very fast, and now we're getting ready to do the opposite, bring the edge out to the remote. Yep. But yeah, I mean, we're doing really good, but I still have so many complaints, and I'm really grumpy that we don't do things the right way.
Yep.
It's all planned out, just to execute.
No, that your time scale a little different, and I think that's fair. I think we look at terrestrial networks and say, yeah, okay, sure, yeah, we'll get there and drive them. We forget those are not the only networks, and there's a lot more networks. And glad to hear you're well on your way, and I think you're further ahead than many other carriers. With regard to the elements that at least you can control, and that some of the your partners here are actually helping you with. But as Bob said earlier, end to end is still a challenge. And speaking of, since you brought up Amdocs, I'm going to go to Angela for the next question here first, which is where the OSS BSS platforms and the ability to support the dynamic network. I think you just heard from one of your customers that indicate that it's there, obviously, for terrestrial networks, or perhaps, right? So Angela.
Look, I think Gint kind of answered this for me. Thanks, Gint, and the check's in the mail. Maybe just a quick little bit of history. So it was in 2017 that Amdocs and AT&T released ONAP as open source, right? And we kind of think of that as the first generation of the OSS for the dynamic network, right? It was all around virtualizing the network. 4 years later, and a couple of things have changed in that time. Networks are not just about the connectivity or about the network functions. It's also now about the compute, the cloud, the edge. And so kind of, the OSS continues to evolve to be able to be cloud native, but also to be able to manage network on the cloud and network on the edge and private enterprise networks and 5G networks. And I've been in OSS for a long, long time, right? And, we've got a lot of incumbency, a lot of maturity. These systems are mission critical to operators, but they continue to change, and they continue to change at the same pace that networks are changing, which is, very, very quickly. I think the point that Jeff made earlier about this doesn't just become about one vendor, okay? So Amdocs, market leader in BSS and OSS, but we do that because we've got an ecosystem around us, right? We're very closely and strategically partnered with a number of the hyperscalers, with some of the other infrastructure vendors, with, maybe to Gint's point, some of the more innovative or disruptive network function vendors that are prepared to go ORAN and non-real-time RIC and to open up with control planes and APIs and software definitions. So we're kind of working in that ecosystem of partners to be able to bring these things together end to end, because that dynamic network, it's not just the network, it's not just the compute, it's got to be the network and the compute, and then this software layer that makes it happen. And that ecosystem has to work and work seamlessly to make that happen.
All right, thank you, Angela. And I know, Bob, you have probably a similar view in terms of what I'm seeing from Netcracker as well around real-time rigs and ecosystem and hyperscaler partnership. Seems like that is that's the new standard in terms of bringing the ecosystem, because an end-to-end can't do it alone. And I'll turn it over to you, Bob, first.
Yeah, fully agree. You certainly can't do it alone, and part of that comes down to interoperability, right? So even at the software layer, it's not going to be everything from Netcracker or everything from Amdocs or vendor XYZ. You have to be open, and you have to prove that whether it's orchestration, whether it's RIC, whether it's other components, that you can interoperate with network vendors, with other software vendors, with infrastructure providers, with partners. So that openness and that ability to implement in different ways and plug into different ecosystems becomes critical. So the componentization of each of these areas is very important, and that's why we're strong believers in cloud native OSS and BSS, to make sure that we can fit in and plug in, whether it's an individual component, a domain orchestrator, whether it's a RIC. It doesn't matter what the component is, we need to be able to work with anyone and everyone. So that becomes critical to make these environments work from an end-to-end perspective, because not every service provider is going to have the same ecosystem, and that flexibility becomes critical under those scenarios.
Thank you, Bob. No, appreciate that, and absolutely. And we seem to be pushing up on this partner and ecosystem conversation. Given we have about 10 minutes left on the schedule, I'm going to move things around slightly, but combine the questions in a way that hopefully makes sense. Which is, I'm going to start actually with the one and then Jeff, which is talking about these partnerships and this evolution of the carriers. I'll start with the one. Do the carriers have the right DNA to build it? And it seems like, regardless of whether they have the right DNA to go all the way, to build these dynamic networks, seems like they need partnerships. I'm going to ask you a joint question, which is, do carriers have the right DNA? Given that we've been doing this for 10 years with NFV now, and we're kind of making some progress. And then what's the role of the hyperscalers, and how do you see the partnership? So I'm going to ask a joint question, first to Dewan and then to Jeff. Sure.
So I would say yes and yes. I think you had two questions in there.
Well, that was quick, right?
I'll delve a little bit. I think over the last 10 years, we've had a transition. We've completely transformed our core network, from an NFV. And I think that starts to your point around the transformative nature and the transition that we've been going through. But from a partnership perspective, I think that I piggyback off two themes that were just said from the last panelist around interoperability and ecosystems. So, our DNA, to your question, we acquired, and Terramark was a big part of that from a cloud perspective. So cloud is in our DNA. We've divested those assets, but it's still part of our DNA of who we are. And now, as we look at partnerships, we have a unique partnership with my co-panelists here that you're passing it to, with Azure on the 5G MEC partnership with Azure, which we're extremely excited about. We have a public MEC partnership with another player that we won't mention, but I think that ability, we had this conversation earlier, but I think that ability to build from where we were and where we've transformed to build out the ecosystem, to the theme that we're just talking about, and partner in a new and unique way, I think becomes exciting for not only us, but also our customers as well.
Good. Thank you, Dewan. And all right, Jeff, since it looks like the one's partnered with hyperscalers that start with A, let's start with you, Jeff. So
sure,
what's the role of the hyperscaler in this ecosystem building?
And I'll provide two answers. One having my IETF hat on, another one obviously as part of Azure. So we need to be able to provision resources on the network, being Verizon, our great partner, being any other network, and customer of particular network or slice need to be able to express their intent in reasonably high level terms, but get network fully provisioned, right? So this is what IETF has been very busy with last 2 years, building number of data models and what we call network controller that will take very high level set of APIs and intents and translate it into something like optical path, segment routing path, and LSP, right? So translating intent into low-level building blocks is mandatory. Again, to Bob's point, you need to be able to measure at any point in time, and it's multi-layer now. You go from optical to Ethernet to MPLS. So on this side of things, a lot of work is going on with data modeling, with abstraction of interfaces towards network, and being able to program network vertically pretty much from user request up to potentially programmable ODM to provision optical path. At some point, all of this is going to come to hopefully us, right? And in order to be able to treat the traffic, the different profiles of traffic in the right way, we need to understand what that we are getting. So here we are talking about larger standardization point where 3GPP works with ATF, works with MEF to define this end-to-end identifier. When you look at particular packet, you should be able to say, this is my lossless network, this is my scavenger, I don't really care, but I still need to process it. But you need to be able at any point in time, looking at the packet, say what it is, and it requires very scalable control management plane, which is really not end-to-end because there are different pieces. There's Verizon piece, there's Microsoft piece, there's potentially third party doing ORAN, but they need to be able to talk to each other, and intent should be well understood end-to-end. So as industry, we are working on creating part of this unique identifier, which could take a form of slice ID in mobile network, which could take, I don't know, MPLS label form in IP MPLS networking, but the semantics need to be understood end-to-end. And this is how, when you bring traffic to hyperscale layer, we'll be able to take it and treat it accordingly with regards to how your control plane, how your OSS BSS really requires this traffic to be treated. So again, we're talking end-to-end in any possible way, but now you also need right integration points between different parts of on-premises versus transport versus your compute and potentially packet core running on cloud.
Got it.
So if I could quickly ask on that, are you getting ready to offer us a network slice as a service across the Azure network? Because I'm ready to order it.
You're always getting the best slice possible.
It's called the GINT slice. Whatever you want. It's the GINT slice. So I'm going to move us along. We've got a few more minutes here. This is when it starts getting interesting always. Anyway, so Jeff brought up a couple of open source and standards bodies in his conversations, the MEF, and all usual suspects, right? Are there other standard bodies or open source projects that are relevant to this whole ecosystem building in terms of dynamic networks? And start with Bob and then Angela.
Yeah, sure. So one of the bodies we're participating in is the Telecom Infra Project. So TIP, and we're focused on Open RAN and making sure that we can open up the network and make it interoperable. And that includes doing things like plug fests to make sure that with various Open RAN vendors and our software that there's interoperability, there's automation. So we think that's an important project to really open up the RAN. Jeff mentioned Metro Ethernet Forum. That's another great one. We did some great work with Microsoft there, showing how you can orchestrate and push applications and services out to the edge and automate that for mobile networks. So these types of projects that we're doing with these standard bodies are very important because not only do they prove out the concepts, but they help set the standards for interoperability and make sure that the service providers can leverage the vendor ecosystem to give their customers the services that they want.
Got it. Angela, any other organizations you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd touch on the 5G Open Innovation Lab, which is based in the US. And Microsoft, as well as Amdocs, are founders, along with a number of other big technology platform companies. And it's really got three parts around it. It's got these big technology platforms that form the basis of, the compute and the connectivity and the network. It brings in the app and device developers who are really bringing in the innovation around these digital transformation use cases. And then it brings in some of the early innovator and adopter enterprises. And you bring those three big industry groups together to really incubate around these digital use cases and how they're going to work across the network and across the compute. And it's really focused around the here and now, right? So farming, manufacturing, shipping and logistics and transportation, healthcare, education. There are real use cases coming out. And it's not just about even coming up with the use case or how you will monetize the use case, but the complexity. I think, we were talking about it earlier, the complexity of trying to bring together the compute and the connectivity and the edge and the app and the device and the spectrum and the software layers and the monetization layers and the partners and the ecosystems. How do you make all that stuff work together? That's what the 5G Open Innovation Lab's working on. So I think it's a really interesting area.
Yep, it is, and it's exciting. So I'm going to turn it over to the one for sort of the last word here. I mean, you've mentioned a lot of pieces, a lot of players. And to wrap us up, it takes a village or a town or a city or whatever what do you call it. And so let's not look at who's outside the village, but who's in the village. So what are the key relationships, within this ecosystem to help carriers succeed? The one.
Sure, I would be
Make
remiss.
it good. It's the last word. You got to be
Well, geez, why put that much pressure on me? I was just going to say, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Verizon's participation in the 5G Future Forum as we look at interoperability across MEC and 5G as well. So that's a critical piece for us. But I think we've touched on all of the critical points here, interoperability, ecosystems, partnership. I have enjoyed today's discussion, as I always enjoy these discussions. I think it's informative and a very dynamic, no pun intended, discussion today.
All right, thank you, Dewan, and thank you, panelists. Thank you, Jeff, Gint, Bob, and Angela. Always a pleasure. And so, thank you, audience, for having been with us. And hopefully, you enjoyed the conversation. And if you have further questions, I'm sure the panelists will be happy to entertain them as well. So go ahead and feel free to reach out. And thank you to the Layer 123 folks for having us.
Thank you, Roy.
Thanks.